It's Mr. Wayhoff to see you, sir.
Bring him in. Mr. Riley, Mr. Wayhoff.
How's it going?
It's good.
So, Mr. Wayhoff, what brings you over here tonight?
Just a little talk about the voting rights between the servants.
How do you feel about that?
We'll get into that later. How was your day?
My day was good. Just finished a nice round of golf.
Awesome. I love your house. It's so beautiful.
Thank you, thank you. Hey, Dominic, could you go get me a sherry? Dominic, get me a sherry. Before we move on with this discussion, let's move this into the conservatory.
I agree.
Dominic, bring him here.
Are you stupid? Give me my drink.
Dominic, give him his drink.
So back to our discussion.
Right. Our peasant servants think they should have voting rights.
It's preposterous to think that they should believe that they deserve things like that.
Absolutely ridiculous.
It's just amazing how the bottom of our society believes that they can speak for all of us.
I think the reason they want voter rights is to bring up a minimum wage law.
I heard they want £1 a week. Could you ever imagine these people getting £1 a week?
If people like this got minimum wage of £1 a week, it would destroy my business.
Yes, and imagine not living like this. We deserve this. These people do not deserve this.
Not the least bit. I'm sorry, Mr. Wayhoff, but I really need to get back to my work.
That's fine. I had a great conversation with you. I'll see you soon. Call my driver.
It's time to go, sir.
Yes, I waited an eternity.
I'm so sick of this. I think it's time for us to stand up for our rights.
I agree.
This way, sir.
Fair pay for fair people.
In England, voting rights were always historically linked to land ownership. If you owned property, you could vote. You could even have more than one vote if you owned enough. However, if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. It was that simple. So in this scene here, while these brave women fight for the vote, look at the policemen. Policemen primarily lived in boarding houses and didn't own land. That's right, the policeman arresting her didn't have the vote either. Before the first Reform Act in 1832, roughly 1 man in 10 had the right to vote. After 1867, the time of the Second Reform Act, this figure rose to 4 in 10, as the amount of property you needed to qualify was reduced. More men qualified, but most men were still disenfranchised, principally because only 1 man in any one household was allowed to vote, denying any resident sons and brothers. From 1918, all women over the age of 30 could vote, and all men over the age of 21. Then, finally, absolutely equal rights to vote were introduced with the Equal Franchise Act of 1928. We can see from this that the right to vote in England up until 1918 was always about class and never about sex. Only the 10-year period between 1918 and 1928 could legitimately be claimed to be discriminatory on the basis of sex. But the suffragette movement was active since 1906 in England, solely concerned with votes for women.
Votes for women! Votes for women! Our daughters' daughters will adore us, and they'll sing in grateful chorus. Well done, sister suffragette!
Men that were involved in the suffrage movement, and there were many more men campaigning than women, were in favour of votes for everyone, not just votes for men. If most men could not vote in 1906, why would women start a radical movement concerned only with the women's vote?
£5.93 an hour. That's the current adult rate of the national minimum wage. When it was first introduced in the late 90s, it was £3.60 an hour. Now, that may not sound like much, but back then, the very idea that employers should have to pay a minimum amount to their staff was pretty controversial.
Up every morning just to keep a job. I have to work my way through the hustle and mob.
From cleaners to canteen workers, low pay was a way of life for many in the 90s.
All I want to do is be paid a decent hourly rate for the amount of hard work that I actually put into what I do.
Then in 1997, a Labour minister who'd been a kitchen worker himself was given the job of changing that.
I couldn't believe my luck. It's like winning the pools. There was me, a former low-paid worker, suddenly be given the job to introduce a national minimum wage. So it was a crusade as far as I was concerned. I knew the subject backwards. I understood what it meant to be a low-paid worker.
And this was why.
I got sacked for asking for £1 a week extra to take account of the birth of my second child. And so it's very difficult, really, to be honest with you.
An emotional response from a man who'd fought for years to change perceptions about low pay, even getting people to dress up as fat cats outside firms critical of a national minimum wage. He also had to convince some unions that skilled workers wouldn't lose their bargaining power.
Well-off workers were being persuaded through their own union, but the propaganda, that their differentials, and they're very conservative, a small c, skilled workers at times, so that they didn't want the minimum wage to undermine their negotiations. And so to be able to persuade well-paid workers to vote for low-paid workers, then we have to give them assurances.
He also had to make a good economic case at a time when Labour was working to make itself electable.
After 18 years in opposition, I think the leadership, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, wanted to ensure that there was no weaknesses that could be exploited.
What kind of opposition did you come up against when you were trying to get that bill through?
It was the longest uninterrupted session of any bill to go through Parliament. And the Conservative opposition were doing their job, by the way. Their job's to oppose. But I decided this was a delaying tactic too much, and I needed to get it through. Low-paid workers had waited long enough for a minimum wage.
It is because we have a Labour government that 2 million people will begin to be released from poverty pay.
The national minimum wage became law in 1998. The moment it was voted through is still etched in this former Trade and Industry Minister's memory. My feet were off the ground. I was getting carried through the lobbies. The place was packed with Labour MPs and people saying, this is what I came into politics to do. The atmosphere was unbelievable. There was absolute joy, overjoy and clapping and cheering. And I was getting passed between people out the door.
And how important was it for you to get that legislation through?
In government you get lots of things to do. and sometimes you like doing them and sometimes it's not so interesting, put it that way. But this was really important to me. I'd have died in the ditch for the minimum wage.